And okay, it should be recording, and I just have the presentation. So what I was going to look at today, hang on, is games-based learning. And it's really, I suppose, where things okay. So it's really, I mean, I suppose when you're looking at using games in youth work or using games in development education, I suppose the thing that the space that's already very much occupied by games in the education space is what's called games-based learning. And it's really well established as a way of educating. So if ever you were talking, you found yourself in a conversation with games designers, or if you ever found yourself in a conversation with people who were into games, and you were sort of trying to describe what we're doing, they'd say, is it gamification, which we did last week, which is adding game elements to what you want to do? Or the second thing that they'd be familiar with, or most people involved in the games industry would be familiar with, is what's called games-based learning. So again, I was just going to today go through in detail what we mean by games-based learning. So it's really about using games in an educational context. And I suppose the type of education that games-based learning sits under is what's referred to as experiential learning. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but experiential learning is a way of learning by having an experience and then analyzing that experience. And the experience can be a board game, it can be a computer game, or it can be a role play game. So games-based learning applies equally regardless of what format the game is in. We're going to focus more on computer games and digital games in a games-based learning context. But it's everything we're talking about is equally true whether you use other types of games in a context. So we're going to talk about what games that, and we're going to look at pedagogical context for games-based learning. What we mean by that is how games-based learning facilitate learning, and then how games facilitate learning. And then we're going to look at genres of games, and then we're going to look at digital games in particular, and we're going to look at different things that are happening at the moment that might be interesting. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion around what we mean by games in this context, in the context of games-based learning. But if you look at the broadest sense, at the concept of play, and play in education, and play in youth work, play in development, play in all of I suppose the big space that we're looking at is the space of play. But within play, there's a subsection, and that's games. And games are play with purpose, with rules, with conflict generated within them, with outcomes anticipated. So games are a form of play, but it's a restricted form of play. It's not free play, or it's not. So it's using play to engage people in a game. And then I suppose at the center, and this is where we're looking at, is what's referred to as meaningful play. And that's play that has all the characteristics of another type of game or any type of game, but that you're trying to use the game to achieve a particular purpose. And I suppose the reason that that's really powerful, this meaningful play, or the use of play in education, or the use of play in youth work, or the use of play in development education, is that within a game, players exert effort, and they exert effort in order to change the game. And in exerting that effort within the game, they become attached to where the game is going. and the consequences of how they're played. So when you make decisions within games, you become invested in the outcome of that decision. Even though you might realize in some games that you made the wrong decision, you still have to follow that through. So that is really a powerful learning tool for people. They can experiment, they can get things wrong, they can try out new ideas. But that definition, or that quote at the bottom there by Jewell is this famous games design writer. But at the essence of that is the sense in which games give agency. So it gives players power. And that power, it's artificial power, but it's power nonetheless. It's power to affect the outcomes of the game. And that sense of agency on the part of players can be an enormously powerful tool to get people to engage with issues. Okay, so if we look at the different types of games that are out there and the different types of games, there's loads of them, but there's puzzles. I don't know if people use these puzzles, but there's a box of puzzles, or there's loads of these that you can get now. Aldi, I've noticed, are selling them regularly, but it's little brain teasers of physical three-dimensional puzzles, and can be really useful in terms of getting people. They can be enormously frustrating, but they can be really useful in getting people engaged in an activity together. Simulation games are things like The Sims, where you're trying to recreate something that people would be familiar with in real world. Action games, adventure games, and the thing about the action and the adventure game that's important is that the story is really important for people, that the story resonates with people. And then you have strategy games. And I suppose this can be a real challenge, when you're designing games, even the 3 games that we're looking at in the workshops, is that really what we're talking about in terms of climate change and development education lends itself best to a complicated strategy game, something like the game that Drogra brought. But strategy games are enormously difficult to design because the thing about a strategy game is that when somebody plays it, they have to feel as if they have the freedom to make quite substantial choices within the game, and that they can move in very different directions, and they're not limited in many ways by the limitations that you'd have on moving from square A to B to C to D, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 around the board. So strategy games are very complex by their nature. So if people were using strategy games, the way you often use them is to modify existing games. RPGs are role-play games, and then you have logical games, and FPS is the abbreviation for first-person shooters, which are, I suppose, probably one of the most prolific type of game that's out there, where the objective is to shoot things or people, or not to be shot. So they're the types of games oftentimes they're there. And first-person shooter, one of the first ones, and we saw it last week, or I would have showed a video of it, is Space Invaders is a first-person shooter. But now you have, say Red Dead Redemption. You have a lot of very sophisticated computer games that are first-person shooters, but the original one would have been something like Space Invaders. And then you have a genre, and the genre of a game, it's very similar to the genre of a film, and a lot of the language around game development has been inherited from films. And a genre really talks about the type of story that the game, or the space that the game is occupying. So you can have drama games, you can have mystery games, you can have crime games, fantasy, horror, science fiction, and serious games would be the genre that I suppose what we're trying to do would fall under. I'm not really comfortable with that as a name, serious games, but that's generally how people would describe games that are looking to encourage people to engage with serious topics. And then if you look at the platforms that we play games on, you play them on computers, you can play directly on the web, you can play them on mobile phones, boards, cards. Augmented reality now is where you have a combination of real world visuals and computer generated visuals, virtual reality, and Second Life. And I suppose these are the three they're all interesting, but in terms of the ones that are developing really, really quickly, it's augmented reality, virtual reality, and Second Life. And if you look at the top left hand corner there, that's a typical scene in Second Life. So this, has anybody, this is just, if you have a chance to, I can't see the text now, just but feel free if you want to text. I can't see it at the minute, but have any of you experienced Second Life? Have you ever had a go in any Second Life applications?
Not me.
No, Tracy, no. Have you, Erin? Have you ever had it? Megan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Have you ever tried Second Life?
No.
No? Okay, maybe what I'll do is I'll just explain it. So how it works is that, like, there is Second Life. If you Google Second Life, it'll sort of steer you towards an app. And what it does is it first of all encourages you to identify an avatar for yourself. So in this particular application of Second Life here, all of these sort of characters here are different people who have taken on these, so they've dressed and they've chosen a gender or not, or they've created a certain persona for themselves in Second Life, and they interact with other avatars in Second Life and the people behind those avatars. And one of the things that happens quite a lot in Second Life is you've training programs. So this is a training program. I think it's something it's a business program when the universities run. But what people do is they come and they sort of, in a virtual sense, attend the training seminar, and they share the space with other people's avatars who are attending the same event. Could be from anywhere in the world, and they can interact with the other people that are there. I find it a little bit disorientating as a sort of medium, because it's sort of quasi-social. I can relate an example of a project I was involved with, and I may have spoken about this before, but it's a group of people with autism, and the idea was to support these young people with autism to develop social skills, or to develop life skills more specifically. So they found that a lot of the young people with autism were involved in computers in one way or another, and were quite familiar with Second Life, with this computer animation, this genre of game. So they set up a project in a particular town in England, and what they did was they recreated the jobs center in that town in 3D in a Second Life environment. So they built an exact replica in the computer of the job center, and they created avatars of the workers in the job center, which weren't dissimilar to the people in the they looked to some extent like the people who really worked there. But there was one woman working in the job center who became the liaison, and she always wore a particular red scarf that to nobody else would have meant anything. It might have been a flashy red scarf, but it wasn't particularly noticeable. But she was highlighted in the game as this avatar with a big red scarf. And the people with autism were encouraged um, to navigate their way through the job center, and that they would know if they were ever distressed that the woman with the red scarf was a person they could rely on to understand their distress. Um, so they felt, and they could see her in the online game, and then when they went to the job center, she was there with the red scarf. And they were also pointed out a safe space in the job center. So there was a little space within the job center, that if somebody made their way to that space, this woman would notice, and she'd come out to meet with them. Um, and it was people with autism who designed the game, and who would mentor people within the game as to how they maybe navigate the space of the jobs club to feel comfortable then when they actually attended it. It was interesting, but I went through the program with the young man who was facilitating it, and it was amazing. He told an amazing story, and we sat opposite each other on the computer at a table. And what I noticed was that there was this flicker out from behind his head, but it turned out that his avatar had this enormous fox's tail. And I asked him about the fox's tail, and he just said that was his persona. So Second Life is peculiar. It's peculiar. I think a lot of young people don't use it, and they avoid it because they would say it is peculiar. It's a strange experience. But it's there, and it's used quite a lot, and you can create exclusive spaces in Second Life for training. So anyway, that's Second Life. If you look at game modes that are out there, you have single or multiplayer. So single, obviously, you're on your own. Multiplayer, you're playing with other people. You have linear and non-linear. So what a linear game is a game that goes from A to B to C to D to D, F. You have levels maybe. And other ones you don't. You're just rambling around experiencing different things at any particular time. So there's no, I suppose, natural sort of progression. And then you've synchronous or sequential. And what that means in a game is that synchronous means anything can happen at any time. So you enter into the game, and all of a sudden anything can be thrown at you, and you have to respond to it. Sequential means that you expect different things to happen in a sequence. So the better you get at the game, the harder the challenges might be. Synchronous means it's not necessarily that's not necessarily the case, that you're not developing your skills or your abilities as you go through the game. It's just you landed in the game and you have to figure it out. Persuasive games are games whose job it is to change your behavior. So persuasive games are games with a behavioral change message. And pervasive games, I mean, this is just to give you, are games that are going everywhere, that are getting everywhere. So it's pervasive. It's games that are becoming very much part of our culture. Alternate reality games are games that try to create a different way of living, or a different experience of life. What it I could show you an example, but it's sort of like a game that might mimic the world without oil is one. So it's an alternate reality, or a zombie apocalypse is an alternate reality. It's sort of like the world, but not necessarily as we know it. And you can have collaborative games or competitive games. And then I suppose this idea of experiential learning or context-aware learning, it's where you're encouraging people to be more aware about the context in which they live and which other people live. You know, so that would sort of broadly speak and look at the type of modes that games are. I've World of Warcraft over there. as an alternate reality game. It's a role play game, but again, it's collaborative. There's lots of different different characteristics to it as a game. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I would say within youth work, within development education, games are used everywhere. They've always been used as energizers, as icebreakers, team building exercises, and for professional development, personal development, sorry, and for reflections. So, I mean, I think most people involved in youth work in one way or another use games. And there's lots of theories out there about how games can be used or have been used. I've spoken before about this games for actors and non-actors, Augusto Boal, and um, I'll make some of these, any of them that I have on digital formats, available to you. I'll bring some books along to the next session as well, because I know Mark had expressed an interest in some books, but I'll bring some, and you can. I've gotten a few books recently, especially around using games in youth work. So that's really it. I mean, so when we're looking at games, it's people refer to games as an experiential learning tool, and the cycle of experiential learning is where you give people a concrete experience, you observe and reflect on it, and that from that observation and from that thinking about what they've experienced, they become more conscious of the complexity of an idea, and that's complexity from their perspective. From my perspective, it might be a reasonably straightforward idea, but for them, it's an abstract concept. And it could be a mathematical concept, or it could be a concept around global trade or climate change. But they're developing this concept, this way of understanding things differently. And then what they're doing is they're testing it. They're trying to see through the game, do I understand this abstract concept correctly? Or what if I changed this? What would happen to that? So it's testing out, and then it goes back to the experience then in testing. What experience do you get? And there's another observation and reflection, and form another concept, and sort of continue on like that. So that cycle of learning or experiential learning begins with an experience. It begins with having experienced something and then reflecting on it, developing abstract concepts. The next slide is if I remember correctly, is similar. I'm not going to dwell on it, but sorry. But again, it's the same idea. It's moving knowledge and concepts. So I'll leave that by. But this is a sort of a slide that's taken from a book that was written in, I actually can't see the year there. There's something blocking, but I think it's 1978. And what it's really is looking at is how you use games in a learning environment. So if you're going to use games in youth work around an issue, there's lots of different ways of using it. One is that you can prepare people around the issue and give people a sort of a sense of this is a really important issue in climate change or biodiversity, and then tell them you're going to play a game about this, and then play the game, and then debrief on the game, and then follow up. And that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is you do the exact same. You tell people about the issue, you prepare for the game, you play the game, then you debrief, and then you discuss and reflect again, and then you play the game again. And you see, in having played the game once, if they play the game another time, would they play it differently? And some games lend themselves to that. And then you debrief again and you move on. You can play the game a third time. But so the idea is that they learn, and in learning, they change how they behave. And the other way is you just bang. You start by playing the game. You don't talk about the issue that you're going to deal with. You don't brief them beforehand in any substantial way, other than to say, now lads, we're going to start this issue. We're going to start this session or this workshop with a game. They play the game. And then the game, and having played the game, forms the basis for the discussion and the debriefing and the learning. So all of those three are three different ways, and you could probably see how dealing with a certain issue in a certain way might lend itself to one of the three ways of doing it. Sometimes just starting with a game and giving people a sort of an uncomfortable experience, getting them out of their comfort zone, can be a really good way to start. Sometimes that's not appropriate. Okay, so I mean, in looking at games-based learning, one of the things about games is that most games are designed for very basic types of skills and knowledge development. So they're really just about learning mathematical or basic science skills. They're not really aimed towards critical or emotional engagement with issues. So they're not really encouraging people to change their behavior or even question their behavior. So the types of things you want to do in youth work or in development education are quite complex, and they're about behavior and they're about emotional engagement. And games are brilliant at doing that, but not a lot of games have been designed specifically to do it in a development education context. But if you're going to look at where games have been used to understand complex systems and behavioral change, they are found in the private and the state sectors. So, I mean, the classic one is, and this has been going since, it's gone to 1800s, the military have used games and continue to use games as a way of preparing people for very complicated strategic decision making. So, war games, it's obviously something that people would have heard the term, but I think it was Napoleon started training his army by having what he called war games. So it was, I mean, obviously two of his own armies pretend to fight each other, or pretend, in order for the generals or for the soldiers to learn strategy. So games are used a lot in private training now, more so than in the state sector. So the places you find the most sophisticated games are oftentimes private companies teaching their employees how to work production lines, or how to and we can talk about that in a second, but they're used quite a lot. But games had been used in education up until the 60s and the 70s even. And they've been used in youth work and higher education in a whole range of different contexts. But they stopped in the 70s. And the reason that they did, I believe, and I don't really have evidence to back it up, but what happened was, up until the 70s, if you were a social scientist or an engineer or a teacher, you could make up a game to suit the context in which you were working. So they were board games, or they were sort of role play games, and people enjoyed making them or adapting them, and that was great. But in the 70s, computer games started becoming a thing, and people started expecting that if they were playing a game, it was going to be a computer game. They lost patience with a lot of the slow pace of role play games, because a lot of them involved manuals with different scenarios, and they were quite complicated. They were very good, but quite complicated to learn how to play, and were slow to play. So computer games started superseding those type of physical games, and educators couldn't program computer games. So if they couldn't control the game educationally, they lost interest. So games fell out of fashion in the 70s, really in the 80s. So I suppose the real challenge I feel now is to, if we're going to use games, is to make sure that the values associated with the games are driven not by the games designers necessarily, but are driven by youth workers or development educators. So it's really about adapting the values and pedagogy, I mean, the way of working in youth work to digital games. Okay, so if you look at the different types of games, puzzles are good at acquiring knowledge. Logical games are good at content and understanding. Strategy games are good at acquiring skills. Simulation are good socially to learn how other people. Role play games can be really good motivationally. Action games, adventure games can be good around attitudinal and behavioral change. And the really, really interesting thing is if you look at action games and adventure games and role play games as well, but the big computer companies, the biggest part of their testing is when they've a game almost finished, they they play test it with their target audience. And the big question they're continually asking is emotional. How did you feel? How did the game make you feel? How do you feel now? 20 minutes later, how do you feel now? So the whole thing that they're trying to get out of people is what is the emotional response people are feeling? Because they realize that in order to keep people engaged with the game, they need to be emotionally invested in the game. And that emotional investment is the same thing that you want in terms of trying to change attitudes and change behaviors in a positive way. So those types of games are really good. Like if you look at multiplayer games, like there's so each of the different genres, each different types of games are good at doing very different things, you know, and good at encouraging different types of change and learning. Okay, so I just wanted to look at, say, maybe some of if you look at knowledge acquisition in games, there's an awful lot of games out there whose objective is around knowledge acquisition. And I'm just, this one on the left there is a game that you can buy, you can subscribe to, and it creates a game that creates puzzles and exercises and challenges for people to fulfill. And as they do, they develop skills and knowledge. It's called Guru. It's good, but it's yeah, it's quite basic. You know, it's a very basic story. So it's really as you climb the mountain, you acquire different levels of understanding or skills about a particular topic, and you as the educator, you as the youth worker, can define what those are. It's a commercial product, so it's relatively expensive for voluntary organizations to buy, but there's a lot of those things out there now. That's one sort of looking. That's one sort of game that's out there in relation to knowledge acquisition. Another sort of application of games, and I've just sort of put an example there of a simulation game, but a, a lot of organizations now are using games they're using games to train people to do skills that otherwise would be quite expensive. So this is a simulated laboratory. So it's encouraging people to develop their skills around how they would mix chemicals and weigh materials and all of that sort of stuff in a simulated environment. Because being in a laboratory and using laboratory materials is expensive. So once you've done 5 successful run-throughs on the simulation, they let you go into the laboratory for real, which makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And then there's ones around sort of safety, health and safety. And again, it's around encouraging people to be conscious of what might happen. So in a simulation game around health and safety, they'll put you through scenarios. If you're going to be a lifeguard or trained as a lifeguard, they'll put you through scenarios that might happen in a swimming pool, and how well you observe, how well you accept, how well you respond to those particular situations. So all of that is reasonably straightforward. And then if you look at, say, role play and simulation games, what they're really about is social motivation. And there's this, we spoke about it last week a bit about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, but Malone's theory of motivation is used a lot in games and games design. And what he talks about is there being, the people are motivated by challenge, they're motivated by fantasy, they're motivated by curiosity, and they're motivated by control. And in a game, if you can keep people challenged, if you can keep people curious, if you can give people a sense where they're in control or they can be in control, and if you can create this fantasy context for that, that's really how you want a game to be, to encourage people and to motivate people. And especially if you're trying to motivate them to interact with other people as well. Okay, I'm getting quite close to the end, I think. So if you're looking at role play, the hardest thing in role play is that if you're looking at using role play with young people, and this is one of the things I find, especially with young people, is that they have to give a willing suspension of disbelief. So they have to buy into this. And some young people won't or won't want to, and they'll just want to take the piss. And that's fine. And you can bring them around. But oftentimes with role play game, you have to be conscious that some people like to disrupt. And if they're not, it can be challenging to get them involved. And it does take quite a lot of skill on the part of a facilitator to get people to engage, especially people who are maybe who see themselves as as wanting to challenge. So role play can be quite difficult a tool in terms of physical role play. Computer role play, people are much more easy or they're much more easy to engage with if they're into computer games, but physical role play, people can be uncomfortable with it. This is a role play game I use quite a lot with students. It's called Minorians and Majorians, and it's to put them in sort of very uncomfortable positions in terms of their own values around development and community work and that. And it always throws up really challenging issues. There's another game called the Trading Game. We've spoken about it before. I'm just going to show you this one, Darfur is Dying. I have it here. Or I should have it. I should be able to. I'm going to show. I have a couple of clips. I had problems the last day, so if you can't hear this, or if it doesn't come through video, just tell me. But I think I might have fixed the problem in terms. I'm just going to. This is a game. First of all, before I show it to you, it's a game called Darfur is Dying. It's a little bit old and clunky, but it's a game about development education. And it was developed in the noughties. And I mean, the context was that there was a civil war in Darfur, and a group of students actually developed this game to engage people in lobbying around the war in Darfur. It's I think 4 minutes long, so I'll let it run for a couple of minutes, and then I'll see what you think.
Should it be running already?
Yeah, okay, you can't see it?
No, we can't.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, so for some reason I'm going to try again here. I'll try to get it back. I'll stop share screen. I'll put this one on here. Share. Can you see a video there?
Yes.
Okay. I'll put it back to the start here. Can you hear that?
No sound.
No sound. Okay. Sorry. Unfortunately, it's okay.
I'm sure it's something we can watch ourselves.
Yeah, I can send it
Yeah.
on to you. I can send it
Yeah.
on to you right now. I'm going to have to fix this because it's not. Sorry, I'm going to have to try and fix this as a bit of a glitch because it's sort of. It should really. I should be able to share stuff on screen, but I've had problems with it before. But yeah, I'll send it on to you as a. I'll send it on to you as a clip. But effectively, it's okay. But what I'd always encourage you to do when you look at a game like this is that to look at the values inherent in it, how images are presented, how people who are vulnerable are presented. Because they're not always presented in the way you as a youth worker, as a development educator might want them presented, because they're oftentimes developed by games designers who might not have the sensibility around, I suppose, working with people who are vulnerable or exposed or who are on the margins. So they want to tell the story and they tell it in their way rather maybe than the way that the people themselves might want it told. So it's a really interesting game and it's well worth taking a look at. This is another one, World Without Oil is an augmented reality game. And effectively, again, it was one that came out of a student experience. But the idea was that through people's phones, it prompted them every day. Sorry, it prompted them over the course of a day to try to live in a situation where oil was a crisis. So what it did was, if they were driving to work, it was telling them the price of oil, the price of your diesel or your petrol has multiplied 3 times. So if you need to go to college, it's going to cost you 3 times what it normally would. How do you respond to that? And people would have to make allowances for the new cost, or they'd have to car share, or they'd have to figure out a way of surviving in a different sort of context. And I think the game lasted a week. And its aim was to give people a sense of what things would be like in a world of depleting oil resources. Okay, so in using games, it's around social interaction and fun, engage young people with context, support learning. Like, games are physical or can be physical, and it can be part of, I suppose, other things that you might do within development, within youth work. So, I mean, I know that a lot of you already do this, but when you're using games in youth work, it can be just a matter of picking games that teach about particular things and integrating them into your practice. So playing games like the Game of Life, or playing games like, it could be computer games like Minecraft in a particular way, or it can be other games that you feel have good educational or good learning outcomes, and play them as part of the youth work practice. The other thing is to use simulation role play games to address complex issues. I know a lot of people already do this, and role play games or pieces of theatre, this type of thing can be used to encourage people to talk about things that they mightn't otherwise be comfortable. I suppose the other side of things that's emerging more now around games is this idea of games as a space for learning, and that people learn skills within games. Or they use a game. The last one there is around self-assessment, that I'll make some games available to you that people play, and they play this game in order to better understand their own behavior, their own attitudes, and how their attitudes are changing. There's one game called Those Pesky Gnats, and make. I don't know that it's. I'll get a clip for you on it. And it's a behavior modification game. So young people play it who have been diagnosed with, I suppose, behavior with the support of psychologist, behavior that they need to modify. And the game supports them in going through a program of behavior modification. So increasingly, there's games like that out there. Okay, so that's it. So it's really that sense of games. I can go, but that sense of games being increasingly recognized as a way of learning and as a way of educating people and as a way of encouraging people to change and to modify their behavior. Is that okay? Is there anything there that anybody wants to sort of draw out or discuss? Is there anything you're sort of unsure about? Is there anything you feel?
Sorry, Paul, I just wanted to check the last week's session. I was in last week's session, but it's not showing online that I can find. Nor is the little. Sorry, you've maybe covered this. I was late joining the session.
No. You're. No, that's my fault, Tracy. It should be up now since yesterday or the day before. I can't remember.
No, I checked it there now. I couldn't see it.
Did you not?
I saw it this morning.
Oh, it's maybe under a different date. I was looking for last week's date and I couldn't see anything under last.
Yes, there was. I checked it this morning, and it was online this morning on last week's date.
Right. Okay, I'll check again. And
sorry.
Then,
yeah.
Sorry. And then the questionnaire, the quiz thing isn't shown for today's date.
It's not. No, it's not for today because I had a problem. I'll get it up for you again, but there was just a problem in terms of the scoring on it. It was coming in at 0, and I just needed to try and fix that, and I haven't found a solution. And I'm sorry, Tracy. I did say I mean earlier, but yeah, it's my fault. It should have been up closer to last week. It's just the file just turned out to be much bigger than the website could deal with.
Oh no worries. No, I was in the online chat last week. It was just for the week quiz thing. I didn't get to it.
No, that's cool. That's I'll and I've the problem solved anyway, so we won't have it from here on, and I'll fix the quizzes as well.
Tracy, I just checked it. So it should be there on the last week's date. Please double check it. Should you not be able to see it for some reason, then get in contact with me. Then we try to solve that issue. But it is online now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm driving at the minute, so I'll check once I get back then.
That's brilliant.
No worries.
So I hope you're not watching the screen while you're driving, Tracy.
I'm trying to multitask very well here.
Oh, holy God. Do you want to tell us exactly?
I'm only jumped into the car there during the last 5 minutes.
Do you want to tell us exactly where we are so we can call the police?
There is a question from Aaron, by the way.
Okay.
Just a quick question about the quiz. Is it still not working? Thank you. So
it's work. I need to get it. I do realize it's still coming in at 0, and I'll get that fixed. I just haven't. I haven't been able to get the guy to go again, but I'll have that fixed. Hopefully by tomorrow.
yeah, now she's just replying. Sorry, I heard what you have said. Just
okay, that's good. That's grand. That's grand. I suppose the other thing, just to get a sense of, for the workshop in Dublin, there was 2 things. I know I had been saying about VR, but I haven't been able to get the headsets for that set, so I was going to maybe do our last session, do a big VR session in our last workshop in in the last of the workshops. So what I was going to look at was we have the 3D printers, and I'm going to look at maybe a little bit of coding as well. So it'll be computer based this time around, while we have access to the computers in Brad Oak. I suppose the main thing that I need to get a handle on, and I'll need to get in touch with you maybe over the course of the week, is what it is we're going to make. So we need to figure out, do we know what pieces, broadly speaking, each of the 3 games need to make? So we could just maybe make a stab at that, and I can send an email around with Catherine to see if you could make a list of the different pieces you'd like to make, and we can get that set up.
Yes, we can send an email around so that everyone can respond to that.
That's great. That's great. Okay. Well, I mean, are we okay if there's no other questions? We can leave it at that for this week.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Aaron.
Bye.
Okay, all the best.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
All the best.